Welcome to the Big Ideas Transforming Africa. This is an initiative of UNDP Africa where we give a platform to the people from the continent that are doing fascinating things, moving the pace of accelerating Africa's structural economic transformation and sustainable development. My name is Joy Kategekwa. Today we have a fascinating woman from the continent, Miss Efe Ukala. She's the founder and CEO of ImpactHer, an initiative that is supporting women to access markets outside of the continent. The first time we came into contact with Efe was in the time when we were preparing our Futures Report 2021. And the impressive work she's doing, connecting women and their products to markets in the diaspora, is a story of impact. So let's go straight to her and let's hear the story. Efe, welcome to UNDP Africa. Thank you for coming to our offices today, and we're very keen to hear the story of ImpactHer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joy. It's such an honor to sit here with you and share the story. ImpactHer started a few years ago as a result of noticing the gap for women entrepreneurship for women entrepreneurs on the continent. I was heavily helping structure investment into the African continent. In fact, I've helped structure about 1.3 billion. But while doing this work, I noticed that not a lot of women were the recipients of this capital, and that sort of puzzled me to figure out, what is the problem? Why don't we have a lot of women recipients? There were women in the pipeline, but not those receiving. So that was really what triggered me to start ImpactHer, to really help bridge that capital gap, to help bridge that access to finance gap. I had a choice then. I could have written about it. I think I'm a decent writer, but I decided that I wanted to be part of those that was helping to move the needle.
Interesting. And so what is ImpactHer?
ImpactHer is a nonprofit organization that focuses on connecting African women to capital, institutional capital, also focusing on connecting them to markets, be it within Africa or outside of Africa, and also helping them bridge their skill gap so that they can scale their business in the manner in which they would want to. Now, scalability depends on the woman's vision. We don't force her to let her know, what she should scale it into. If she wants to scale to having one store, great. If she wants to scale to have 20 stores and get investors, great. But she dictates that story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And what are you seeing in terms of the success coming out of your initiatives on the continent?
The success has been quite great. We've had wonderful stories. I would use an example for a woman who started her clothing store in her apartment when we met her. And she was quite keen to open her first store. And we literally worked with her within months to get that store opened. And she now has a store in where we call Lekki in Lagos, catering to Lagosians and also people outside Lagos. Something we also helped her do was to prepare those clothing for the export market, in that you have predefined sizes, not all bespoke, while also catering to her bespoke clients. I think during COVID as well, we had interesting women that were working so hard to ensure that their businesses didn't shut down, because obviously that was a theme during COVID, where we saw a lot of small businesses shutting down. So we were able to help a few women. One of them was a restaurant owner whom we helped pivot to produce shelf-ready food, right? And in fact, after doing that, she came back to say she's made more revenue after COVID than before COVID, because now she had diversified, right? And it took us about 6 months to produce that new product that went on the shelves in the store, as well as helping women raise funds. So those are some success stories that we've had recently.
Yeah, you talk about COVID, and COVID, upended everything. As you said, women were really pushed aside in terms of closing. We had the lockdowns, but we also had the absence of capital to sustain these sorts of businesses. And this lady you talk about managed to pivot.
Yes.
But what have you seen as the impact for those that didn't? And where do you see?
Yeah, so it's been quite a mix, right? Because during COVID, in fact, ImpactHer conducted a survey first to understand what did these businesses need to survive? That was the first question. And when we put out that survey, we had over 1,300 responses from about 30 African countries or so. Women running small businesses in these countries were the respondents. 91% of them said, I need money, and I need that money now, or else my business wouldn't survive. So that was the big theme we saw. While we knew that, not all that 91% will be able to get the money they needed from capital providers because there were so many impediments, right? We talk about real access, right, where a woman may apply for a loan and may not really have access, but yet it's a woman-friendly product, right? While that was going on, we figured that it may serve us all best if we help them to pivot, right? So our strategies now became pivoting, right? Pivoting could still help you keep the lights on. And we had people that were clothes manufacturers, for example, women that were making clothes or bed sheets for hotels. We're now pivoting to becoming mask makers. We had women that were making detergents, pivoting to making hand sanitizers, because then if you walked into most African stores, you would find that hand sanitizers were now scarce, right? Because of the importation bans during that period. So, or restricted access to imported goods during that period. So we found that for sustainability during COVID, pivoting became the key word, right? And the flexibility to pivot. And then for those, that really helped those that survived. But for those that you say, what happened to the rest? The rest were those that struggled to pivot, either because of lack of access to capital, access to raw materials, access to production. So what do we see them doing now? Some of them are starting over again.
The resilience to keep at it, the resilience to start over again. And you talk about pivoting. So let's talk about pivoting towards the One Africa market. You gave us a compelling piece in the Futures Report 2021, identifying value chains for a Made in Africa revolution. And in that story, we really saw how you're enhancing connectivity for products made by African enterprise, women-owned enterprises, including in the US, for example. Let's pivot to Africa. What do you see as the opportunities in the One Africa market?
I think for women entrepreneurs, there are lots of opportunities, right? And if we're looking at it from a sector perspective, food is a huge one. I believe between 2016 and 2018, Africa imported about 80% of its food, right? Yet we have a lot of women playing in that market, right? Textile is another. The US, for example, exported about 700 million worth of used clothing to Africa. Yet we have places like Ethiopia that produce clothes, right? Pharmaceutical, right? Let's talk about medicine. We have a huge supply and demand problem in Africa regarding medicine, right? And I'm sure you've heard the stories about adulterated medication coming into the country, being dumped into Africa. There is a huge need there. These are actually part of the top 10 imports into Africa. So if as women entrepreneurs, we're looking at it from that perspective, we have those opportunities. Now, the problem there, so I'm looking at those three major sectors, pharmaceuticals, food, and clothing. Now, the problem there obviously is meeting the minimum requirements, right? Because if I went to, for example, Conga today, or ShopRite to say, I want to be able to produce and supply you with, I don't know, beans or something, they're going to say, can you meet our MOQ? So this is where African women need to get a bit more creative. Cooperatives come together to work together to benefit from somewhat of an economies of scale for us to be able to meet Africa's demand. But 1.2 billion people on the continent, there is a huge opportunity for women to help fill that gap.
Yeah, 1.2 billion people and growing. And it's interesting that you talk about the idea of importation, and these sectors you've mentioned are some of those that we profiled in the Futures Report, talking precisely about the fact that with the AfCFTA, you now have a tariff structure that's creating preferential treatment precisely in those. And so it takes us to that point around trade policy enabling intra-African trade. I want to talk to you now about the question of SMEs, because most of the enterprises that you support our SMEs. And I think the key sort of word in there is the small, right?
Correct.
And so how do you see SMEs seizing opportunities in Africa, capacity-wise? What are the three big things they must do to ensure they can seize these opportunities?
When I speak to women, and I know it's SMEs in general, right? I always say, build your business to be the best business, full stop. No commas, not as a woman, right? So I think for SMEs to seize this opportunity, which is huge, is produce quality, be it service or good. Let's focus on that. Don't scale too quickly. Don't scale yourself to failure, right? What do I mean by that? Because a vendor tells you they want 500, you're going to produce 500 at low quality, you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Then that goes to collaboration, right? How do you collaborate with your fellow, food makers association to be able, I think to the point I made earlier, right, to be able to produce? Skill up, right? With the AFCTA, there's going to be a lot of digitalization going on, right? A lot of the tools. How do you ensure that you're able to use that tool to be able to trade across Africa? So I would say digitalization would be another major point for them. So focused on quality, focus on collaboration, and focus on upskilling yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting and also very practical. I found it quite intriguing what you said about don't scale too quickly. So there's the realization that in the market practice, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot, but sort of go about it diligently, even as you prepare to seize this market. So you've talked about what SMEs can do and given us advice on that. They operate in an environment where the frameworks, the enabling frameworks, are sort of out of their hands from a policy perspective. So if you were talking to governments, what would be your advice on what they must do?
I think governments need to invest in creating more practical policies that allow us to pause, look at who the beneficiaries are, look at the markets we're playing in, and ensure that there's a marriage there. I often talk about, creating a policy that, has been transported from Silicon Valley, yet in some of the cities in Africa, we don't have the Silicon Valley infrastructure to support it. So we really have to look deeper, and especially when it comes to women, we also need to think about how are we incentivizing financial institutions on the continent to provide access to credits or other form of capital that are accessible to women. How are we encouraging players to collect gender-based credit data to help support producing products that work for women? We have a lot of, data out there, but it's mixed with men and women, and then we produce something and we make assumptions about women. I think that we should allow our data to guide us, but the government is in a better position to help put sort of incentivization plans such that the private sector would play along with the government to create that enabling environment.
And so I want to take that a bit further and dig your thoughts about what you think the role of UNDP should be in a space of this nature.
Wow, I think UNDP could help ensure that more of these conversations are going on. I don't think there's anything such as, we're talking too much about the problem, right? Because over the years, the problem would wear different, jackets. It's going to look differently. It's going to keep evolving. So I think that there's that room to talk about. There's also the room of the UNDP to probably help influence the governments in a nice way to create policies that work, because one of the biggest issues on the continent now is that policy. No matter how much good work you do, if you walk into a bank and you don't have the money, if you walk on the street and some angry policeman crashes your store and says you weren't supposed to build a store here, you're back to zero, right? So we really need those environments to be enabling so that we're not building and going back to square zero. So I think the UNDP could really help work with governments, work with the private sector to really think about what ought to be done.
Thank you very much. So you're talking about this idea of integrate the conversation, convene the spaces, influence policy, but also work directly with private sector, I guess, to help to get the skills up. You know,
and when I mean private sector, right, I'm also not talking about the SMEs. The multinationals are a huge, if we look at Africa, right, who's really helping push a lot of the needles, right? They are the deep pockets. So let's not forget the deep pockets. We need to bring the deep pockets to the table. We need to figure out how we're getting these multinationals to also work with the SMEs to help them grow, because we know that most of the governments will be focused on the multinationals, not necessarily the SMEs, and making sure that they are creating an environment for that multinational to remain in their countries to employ 20,000 people, right? But how can we make sure that that effect is also trickling down to the SMEs?
Again, great wisdom about the power of business linkages. So, you know, we've come to the end of our conversation, and you know, Efe, on this program, we really talk about the big ideas transforming Africa, and I think you've given us so many about the practice of entrepreneurship, the sitting of women in there, what they can do, you know, to get ahead, but also what governments need to do to facilitate them getting ahead. If you were to summarize it all in one big transformative idea to take Africa ahead, what would that be?
I'm not sure if I would call this innovation, though, but I feel that Africa needs to invest in its infrastructure. I say that, and from infrastructure, when I'm talking about transportation infrastructure, I am talking of energy infrastructure, right? I feel like while we have a lot of and financial inclusion infrastructure, because while we talk about, you know, the new things that ought to be done or this great new idea, do we have the environment that would allow that new idea to thrive, right? When we talk about the women that should be transporting their goods across the continent, if we don't have the good roads for them, or if transportation is too expensive for them to move from Ghana to Nigeria, then we're back to the same place. So I think Africa needs to invest in its infrastructure as well as R&D, research and development, and also figuring out a way to make sure that we're owning our ideas, right? We're not importing them or not buying them off from elsewhere so that we continue to grow. A good example would be, for example, cocoa farmers in Ghana, right? They plant their cocoa, but then export it to somewhere in Europe for it to be turned to chocolate. And guess what? It comes back to Africa, and we buy it at high tag prices, right? How can we make sure that Africa is developing its value chain within the continent such that we benefit from our own growth?
Thank you very much, Efe. I think circling back really to this powerful idea that's the One Africa market, and that being a place for value addition, for industrialization, and a place to promote inclusive growth. I think you will agree with me that we've heard a lot of interesting wisdom about how to transform Africa. And it's now for me to thank Efe Ukala, CEO, founder of ImpactHer. Efe, thank you so much.
Thank you.